Okay. Thank you, Rajkumar. Um, Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to our speaker for the day of the series An Evening with an Expert, Professor Anirban Ray. And Professor Roy has joined the Department of English, Presidency University, Kolkata, as an assistant professor on the 8th of July 2013. He has been enrolled in the PhD course in 2015 in the Department of English, Jadavpur University. He wrote his thesis under the supervision of Professor Nilanjana Gupta, exploring the contextualization of ancient Egyptian art and mythology in selected Western films and movies. He has submitted his PhD thesis and at present is waiting for his thesis defense. So, with this short introduction, I would like to hand over the microphone today to Professor Roy. Over to you, Professor Roy.
Thank you, Professor Mukherjee. Is the first slide visible to everyone?
Yes, it is.
Right,
It is.
right. Okay. Thank you for inviting me. And I would like to thank Professor Rajkumar Borman, Head of Department of English of Gokhale Memorial Girls College. And I would also like to extend my thankfulness to almost a brother figure of mine, Professor Shubham Dotto, and the way that he approached me, I hope that he believed that I will be able to share some of my a very interested field in which I have been working for quite a number of years now. By now, and I'd also like to thank our student of presidency. She is a student of PG2 English, Orna Deepangi, because she was the one who connected Professor Dotto and me. And I'd also like to kind of, thank my dear students of Kokan Memorial Girls College, Department of English, for staying back for listening. I know that maybe all of you are tired by now. It's the end of the day. I would request you to just listen to it as a sort of adda. You don't have to approach it with a very serious kind of concentration. Just kind of look at it as some sharing of some ideas because this area uh, is a bit different. The methodology that I have taken in my both in my PhD thesis and also in this presentation, it might not directly help you in any way, but it might trigger some interest in thinking about how the Occident tries to map and develop a cartography of the Orient with references to the Oriental myths. And I'm sure you must have known by now that poet H.T. Coleridge was very, very interested in comparative mythologies. So we will refer to him, though he is not exactly he will not be taking the central attention in this presentation. I'll be dealing with the three poet friends, John Keats, Leigh Hunt, and Percy Bysshe Shelley. But I will keep referring to Coleridge because Coleridge developed an extensive thought repository of thoughts regarding how archetypes of myths and images percolate and transpire into Occidental thoughts and the writing of poetry. So, if you look at the concept note here, I have provided very briefly the methodology for today's discussion that I'm reading from the concept note that the three texts, that is the three sonnets which we are going to look at, shall be compared with references to Egyptian art and mythology. And these two are very inseparable because the Egyptian art tends to be very functional in nature, as Professor Cyril Aldred, one of the most distinguished professors in Egyptology, have written extensively. His book was one of the first books that I read on Egyptian art, and he elaborates in his book the Egyptian art that how the Egyptian art tried to provide a very encyclopedic knowledge regarding their geophysical identity, that is the land of ancient Egypt, and how they tried to kind of negotiate with mystic powers with the use of art in general. So the art in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, tends to be very functional and very performative from that angle. So, the points of convergence in today's presentation will be the visual elements within the texts by these three English poets, and the aquatic symbolism and the stellar beliefs. By stellar beliefs, I mean that stellar beliefs is not exactly astronomy, but it's a prelude to astronomy to understand how the stars move, because you see that the Egyptians developed one of the first accurate calendars in the world, and they were very, very patient observers of stars. They identified many of the stars and constellations, and they had a very elaborate metric system in which the sky and the earth, they were conjoined together to understand the very cosmic existence within which we live. So when we'll be looking at the three sonnets, we will try to link that how, to what extent do these sonnets also try to uh, touch the tip of the iceberg of that huge corpus of Egyptian stellar beliefs. And thirdly, the connection between their river, that is the Nile River, and the concepts regarding their native land. So we will try to look at the ways of expression that Hunt, Keats, and Shelley take over when they are individually engaging with the Nile, and how their texts. I cannot say how they, but their texts, because you see that these texts, these sonnets were written in 1818, so that was way before Egyptology, as we understand now, was initiated. So these poets did not have access to, you see, translations of hieroglyphs or like very elaborate epigraphic survey. What is an epigraphic survey? It's like when an institution with a good deal of funding sends a group to a region in which there are many sites which can be dug, and which and the illustrations on the walls of the sites could be copied so that they could be studied later. Okay, so this is called an epigraphic survey, which were not there much in vogue. Though Napoleon did send his savants, a savant in French would mean the scholar, the artists, the ethnographers, the map makers. Okay, so Napoleon did initiate the Eurocentric interest in Egypt. So when we look at the text proper, as we all know that the text survive the author, okay, and the text provides the corpus and the nexus of further thoughts, which we can sort of engage with. So it's almost like just as we try to read a painting, we try to decipher a code. Similarly, texts can also be read like an archaeologist, like an ethnographer, like a cartographer. Okay, so we will be looking at these elements and trying to compare between the Nile River and the elements given in the texts. Is the second slide visible to everyone, which reads the writing contest between three friends?
Yes, it is. It is.
Okay. Now, when I was preparing for my presentation, this article I came across, poetry, open quote, poetry, uh, poetics and politics in the Nile Sonnets, close quote, by Mona Salah Eldin Hassani. It's a brilliant article. I would request you to read it someday. In fact, Hassanin's article and the the research that I came across in this article was a great inspiration for me to kind of reread and find and add more information to what Hassanin has said. So Hassanin provides us with this information that Keats, Hunt, and Shelley on 4th of February 1818 in Hunt's Hampstead cottage suddenly decided to participate in a poetry contest. And uh, the common theme for each of them was the Nile River. Now, you must have learned by now, I'm sure you must have heard it as well, that Frankenstein as a text was also a product of a ghost story writing competition that took place in Villa Diodati on the in close proximity to Lake Geneva. So you see that the romantic writers they had this practice of kind of spending quality time by entering into competitions. But what interests me is why would the Nile come up? Okay, so when they are kind of trying to read Nile, as I mentioned in this concluding line in this slide, that the Nile tends to be perceived both as an inspiration as well as an occidental romantic quest for imagery and linguistic expressions. It's because throughout the Middle Ages and through the Enlightenment, there had always been Eurocentric quests taken upstream. That is kind of the attempt to discover the source of the Nile, and Nile thereby remained almost like you see a sublime zone, which everyone with a vision would try to ascend and try to reach and touch. And all the poets and all the writers would thereby develop their own perception regarding the source of the Nile. So the river, as well as the spirit and the spirits, both singular and plural, uh, they stand for, you see, that poetic inspiration, that the farthest corner of, you see, human cognitive inquiry. So, from that perspective, the Nile stood as a litmus test of human inquiry, and it also stood as a yardstick of measurement of the limits of knowledge that could be pushed to the farthest corners of the known world at that time. So it's possible that the three friends, the three poets here, they are each trying to kind of read Nile according to their own readings, and they were trying to negotiate with the enormous power that was present within the very idea of the Nile. Not just a physical Nile, that is the physical aquatic stream of the Nile, but at the same time, the very idea of the enormous power that the river had. Okay. So it thereby stood almost as an Egyptian counterpart to uh, the the sacred abode of Apollo and the Muses, if we can read it in that way. And Hellenism was an extreme an influence for the Romantics. We all know that. But the rising interest in Egypt, thanks to Napoleon's expedition in Egypt, was also developing a parallel stream of inquiry so that the source of the Nile was also incorporated as one of those impossible, mystic, sublime sources of poetic inspiration, very much comparable to the abode of Apollo and the Muses. Okay, so this could be one of the reasons why the three poets, the three poet friends, were trying to engage with. Is the third slide visible? The waters, the Nile, and the romantics?
Visible too. It is visible too.
Okay. So before we go into the aquatic symbolism, uh, our methodology should involve that how the aquatics, the Nile River, and the romantics, they could be conjoined in one consortium of floating ideas and symbols. So I came across this very interesting book by Ian Bradley. If ever possible, please give it a read. Water, a spiritual journey, in which Bradley refers to how water stood as an enormous sense of power and inspiration for the Romantics. So, as let's read from this content here that Nicoletta Cioto, cited by Ian Bradley, refers to the three different sea aquatic perceptions by three poets. So, for Keats, he contemplated on the aquatics with a sense of loss, about losing his poetic aspirations. So when he was writing his To the Nile, he possibly was in a very pensive state of mind. He was trying to hold on or hold back to that enormous potential which Nile tends to hold as a promise, but one cannot reach up to it. For Byron, it was energy that was present in the waters. And for Shelley, force and unity, open quote, force and unity, close quote, as CO2 kind of pointed and termed it, that the force and entity of the waters were an inspiration for Shelley. Now, if you look into the imageries of water symbolism in Romantic literature, you will come across that again and again. For example, if we take the example of Kubla Khan, then you will see that how the river Alpheus sort of travels both terrestrially as well as to the netherworld of Xanadu. If we look at Portsmouth, on the Tinton Abbey, there you will also see that the abbey is not reached, but you see the review it is you see the point of convergence that exists between the abbey and the gradually kind of blossoming of the poet figure's consciousness from his youth to his adulthood and maturity, and also subsequent frustration and depression. And well, if we look at the powers of the waters of the sea, then what better example to cite but the ancient mariner, where you see that the sea stands as a litmus test of faith and how uh, uh, what the institutional religion cannot offer. The Neoplatonic spirits, the spirits of the deep, and you see the powers, both terrifying and kind of forgiving powers of the sea, have been sort of postulated and reimagined and conceived in the text of the ancient mariner by Coleridge. So you see that the waters were very important for the romantics. Another reason why the waters were important because uh, especially the second generation romantics with whom we are dealing, that's Shelley and Bliss, they participated in the continental tour and they would travel through the Alps and they would follow the rivers. And they were very interested in trying to harness that power and the current present in the moving waters, and also kind of the powers as perceived in the snow and in the smoke. So these were the elements they got from the transcendental German romantics. And if we look at the German romantic paintings, the theme of the ship, the theme of the fog, the mist, the theme of the ice, then the seashore, they come back before they begin again. These are the different elemental states of water. So water thereby stood as a very, very powerful motive for the Romantics. Now we will try to link what the water held as a source of power for the Romantics with what the Nile itself kind of stood as you see the consolidator of two different kind of symbolisms. Just as Abdullah Ghat here says that he perceives that the Nile exists in dual forms, that famine was a threat in case of the inadequate floods, while overabundance of flood resulted in destruction of crops. So you see that the Nile was a very, how do I put it? It's a fluid supply in a way. It follows its whims, but it is also disciplined in the sense that there is a particular time of the year in which the Nile flood is to take place. And 11th September uh, uh, coincided with the first day of the first month of the ancient Egyptian calendar, which was called Akhet. Akhet was the first month of the Egyptian calendar. And we are thereby in the very first week of the first month of the Happy New Year in the Egyptians. So happy ancient Egyptian New Year to everyone. So this was the time in the ancient times where the flooding of the Nile used to take place. Okay. Now the scenario is a bit different because the Aswan High Dam is there, so the Nile does not rise as it used to rise during the pharaonic times. But the ancient Egyptian calendar was divided into three stages, and the first stage represented the flooding, that is the inundation, and the flood remained for a few months. So this was the time in which you see the representation of you see new life, the regeneration of the new life were considered symbolic in the Egyptian metaphysics and symbolism. That's why God says here that an analogy was drawn between the inundation initiated agriculture, representing regeneration, and the solar demise and regeneration of the western horizon and the eastern horizon, respectively. Now, if we try to draw an analogy between a river, the river rising, bringing promise of new crops, fertility, as well as kind of challenging the lives of the people, in a way that writing and flowing are also the same. Okay, I remember that the concept of Milton's vial was very important for the Romantics. That how the water was always compared with the flow of knowledge, and if we contextualize this in the Indian uh, Hindu metaphysics, then we also would be able to link that Saraswati in the beginning was a river deity in the Vedas, and gradually, when Hinduism was getting institutionalized, she was recontextualized as you see a goddess of scriptural knowledge and wisdom. So in Egypt, this the scenario was the same. That a civilization was developing. It was trying to look at the balance between life and death, the balance between regeneration and demise. And writing is also like that. You always run the risk of uh, either kind of losing your ideas while writing, or you see there are overabundance of ideas and you are trying just to kind of touch and give a physical manifestation to the very fragment of that imagination. Okay, that's why Kubla Khan is a fragment, that the poetic consciousness is trying to uh, flow through the subterranean Alf, then come to the surface of Xanadu, trying to kind of find out the balance between static and the movie. And writing is also about that experience, that how you try to kind of balance, control the flow of thought. And the Egyptians also were trying to establish that that epistemic kind of vigor upon the Nile. The Nile was full of promise, but at the same time the Nile was frightening as well, liquid, but at the same time destructive. So that is the sublime. That sublime would constitute something that you are afraid of, but it's something that also kind of draws you, that attracts you. It's a tremendous attraction that kind of draws uh, us to the sublime. So I will next try to carry this idea of the reconciliation, that how the balance exists in the Egyptian metaphysics about the Nile itself. And if we look into the Egyptian art and mythology, we will see that there was no singular god or goddess of the Nile. The gods and the goddesses, they were all cooperating with each other to ensure that the Nile flows. So there was, you see, a collective divine consciousness and division of labor amidst the deities in the Egyptian pantheon as well. So that you see the cycle of flood always continue, and so that you see prosperity, the flourishing of life are always maintained as a kind of uh, continuously renewed cycle. So the gods and the goddesses, they were all assisting the humans regarding this. So this is one pair, the goddess Satit and her husband Nun. So Nun in the Egyptian art is shown, we can see Nun here, is shown as a ram-headed god. So he has the head of a ram and the body of a human male. And his wife is the goddess Satit, who is usually kind of given a human face. And she, in her crown, we can see that there are the bovine horns, sorry, coming out from both sides of her crown. So the Egyptians were trying to merge the zoomorphic, the nature, with the humanoid. So both the wife and the husband, they were equally kind of participating in the insurance of the flood. Now, how is their function related? So, Noom is the god who uncloses the doors of the river Nile. So, he is the one who is the gatekeeper. So, he opens the gates, and the Nile kind of comes forth from the bowels of the earth and moves towards Egypt. And his wife, Satit, makes sure that the river is carrying all the fertilizing elements along with it. So you see that the husband and the wife, they represent the two aspects of fertility. If the river is kind of rushing with a tremendous acceleration, then it will cause erosion, and too much of erosion will not be a fruitful thing. So the goddess Satit kind of controls the waters, makes sure that the water is moving with the right momentum, so that you see the life-giving qualities of the waters settle down on its banks. So it's a kind of a cooperation between the husband and the wife, the goddess Satit, and her husband Noon, who thereby kind of cooperated together to create uh, and maintain the inundation. So this is the first divine pair that we come across. The second pair is more complex. If we look at in this image, then we see that there is the blue color stands for the sky. Now, according to the Egyptian belief, the sky is also full of watery realm. So there is, water on the land, and there is also water above us. And the gods and the goddesses, all the important gods and the goddesses, they navigate themselves on the boats. We will come across this information again in one of the slides which will follow this, and I will come back again to this slide. But if we look here, is a map of the sky. This is taken from the Dindara temple's zodiac constellations carved on the reliefs. So here, as Verde Coleman provides the explanation, there you can see Satet, whom we saw in the previous slide. So Satet here is standing, and Anuket, the another wife of the god Nun, she is also standing, and the two goddesses they are ensuring that the water is descending from the celestial vase on the earth. So you see that the Egyptians imagine that we exist in a cyclic order of the water cycle, which we all studied in school. So, in a way, their concept of the water cycle was personified in the cooperation of these gods. And here we see is the god Osiris in his form of the constellation Orion. And he is looking back at his wife, Isis, in the form of in her bovine form, and she represents the star Sothis. So, what happens in this time of the year, or rather used to happen in the Egyptian observation, that when the star Sothis, which was the Greek form of the Egyptian word Sobdet, and in the English it is the star Sirius. When the star Sirius used to rise in the horizon, the Egyptians saw that the Nile used to rise. So they made a connection between the movement in the heavens and the movement on the Nile. And we will see that how the romantic poets also tried to kind of, very coincidentally kind of talk about the celestial and the terrestrial kind of connection. We will look at it when we'll be looking at Keats's poetry as also as in Shelley's poetry. So here again we see that there is a cooperation between the divine feminine, that is Isis Sirius, and the divine masculine, that is the Osiris Orion, and they are all on the boat. And I will explain what the boat symbolism in another slide, where I will talk about the Egyptological information regarding the importance of the boats in the Egyptian consciousness. But keep this image in mind. We will be needing this image when we'll be looking at the terrestrial and the celestial connection and conjunction in Keats's sonnet and as also in Shelley's sonnet. So in the previous two slides, thereby, we saw that the river cannot be entirely masculine or entirely feminine. Usually, in the classical sense of the elements, we have seen that water and fire, the fire and air, they are masculine elements, and earth and water, they are the feminine elements. But the Egyptians were more balanced in their gender consciousness. They could not think of the power of the Nile without bringing together the masculine and the feminine. And you see that this element of balance between the masculine and the feminine, you can see in case of Coleridge's Kubla Khan as well, where you see the earth in thick pants breathing, a mighty fountain was forced. It refers to, it's not my idea, these ideas have been given by many of the romanticists and many of the theorists of romantic archetypes. If you are interested, I can provide you to your professors a reading list of these symbols. That how The aquatic symbolism itself stands for birthing process, and birth requires both the masculine and the feminine elements to work together. So if we thereby look at the personification of the blood, we will see that the word happy in the Egyptian hieroglyphs stood for the personification of the inundation. And they try to provide a very interesting iconography to the personification of the inundation, that they showed that there are, you know, breasts, as well as there is a beard. So this particular figure, who is known as the Hapi, and there is no singular Hapi, there are Hapis. As if you go to the Egyptian temples, you will see this huge long succession of hobbies, all bringing the products, the fertility goods, and the products and the consequences of a bounteous inundation. And very interestingly, thereby you see that there was no single kind of name for Nile in the ancient Egyptian vocabulary. So the word Nile that we know has been taken from the Greek Nilos. The Egyptians only used the word Iteru, that means the river. For them, it was the river, the only river, the, the prime circuit of life, the prime biocurrent of life, that sublime and the picturesque, that kind of binds the world together. And they could not think of that principle as uh, as an unitary principle. They thought that the masculine and the feminine should exist in the same personification. And this androgyny was so important for their understanding that we can link it to, you see, Coleridge's and the romantic idea of the androgynous mind, which Woolf later would take up in her A Room of One's Own, so that you will be able to link between the Egyptian androgyny or the concept of the androgynous and how Woolf, and we all know that Woolf had a gender fluid identity of her own, but Woolf was kind of recontextualizing Coleridgean idea of the androgyny. So we can thereby form a history of the movement of thoughts and ideas from the ancient Egyptians through Coleridge to Woolf. So Wolf says here, let's read. So open quote, if one is a man, still the woman part of his brain must have effect. And the woman also must have intercourse with the man in her. Coleridge perhaps meant this when he said that a great mind is androgynous. It is when this fusion takes place that the mind is fully fertilized and uses all its faculties. Perhaps a mind that is purely masculine cannot create any more than a mind that is purely feminine. Right? So we cannot say that the Egyptians were kind of thinking ahead of their times, but they were definitely able to reach at at a watershed moment of gender consciousness. When we say that the concept of sex and gender had always been, you see, say a post 19th century and 20th century kind of phenomenon, I would encourage you to look back at many of, you see, the androgynous figures of different ancient cultures, including ancient Egypt, and try to recontextualize them in the Western theories of sex and gender. That how the idea of, you see, the conglomeration or the amalgamation of the different uh, personifications of the male and the female could be linked with, you see, the creative outburst, the spontaneous kind of an outburst of creativity, and we cannot thereby sort of distinguish uh, as specifically masculine or specifically feminine. So the Nile thereby kind of stood for that kind of that unity of the genders, the unity of the consciousness. So you see that we can thereby sort of link the gender fluidity, the gender fluid consciousness of the Egyptian iconography with the Coleridgean and the later the Wolffian sense of poetic inspiration and creative mind. That brings us to this notion that just as there is an amalgamation between the two different personifications of genders and how they influence the creative force. The Egyptians also kind of tried to link between the terrestrial and the celestial. This very interesting article by Alessandro Berio, entitled "The Celestial River: Identifying the Ancient Egyptian Constellations." Berio there notes that an analogy was drawn between constellation and the administrative district. Thus, a terrestrial Egypt can be held comparable to the celestial Egypt. So the Egyptians thought that just as there is a district where you can travel, similarly there is a celestial counterpart to that terrestrial district in the sky. So there is a sky Egypt and there is a land Egypt. And very interestingly, as Badiou says here, citing G. Terrace's concept and study, that the sailor navigating his or her barge or boat on the Nile is comparable with the sky or the space traveler following the solar route. So, when Europe or Eurocentric agents were trying to kind of take that same route which the ancient Egyptians used to take, they were also trying to kind of grasp that understanding of the heavens and the waters, and how traveling on the Nile thereby would kind of bring one's understanding of Neoplatonism and metaphysics on the same terrain of the sky. So if we go back to this slide which we saw here, this becomes clear that because the boat was a very important mode of travel for the ancient Egyptians, that they were the civilization of the pharaohs, they almost kind of depended on this river route. So it is obvious that they would imagine their gods and goddesses in the same way as the humans would travel. So if you are an ancient Egyptian, you have to travel from this band to that band. You have to travel between the upper Egypt and the lower Egypt. Uh, Throughout the country, there was a very, very kind of centralized administration where taxation was kind of asked from the different districts. So if there were temples being built, there were stone quarries, and the stone blocks have to be kind of navigated downstream or upstream the Nile. So thereby, it was quite evident that they would think of a Nile in the sky, and they would thereby kind of imagine their gods and goddesses as sailors. Okay, that each god and goddess would thereby have his or her own bark or boat, and the gods and the goddesses will sail on the sky Nile just as the Egyptians would sail on the terrestrial Nile. So, if we place from that angle, thereby it becomes clear that traveling around the traveling upstream or downstream on the Nile would thereby mean that you are trying to follow the footsteps and trajectory of the ancient Egyptian thought of bringing the heavens and the terrestrial art together. So, when we thereby look at Keats's text, how does the love for Egypt and the love for Egyptian symbolism can be perceived here? If we read the lines from the sonnet to the Nile, son of the old moon mountains African. So moon mountain itself stands for that the bringing together of the moon, the celestial and the terrestrial. Chief of the pyramid and the crocodile, we call thee fruitful, and that very while a desert fills our seeing inward span. Nurse of swart nations since the world began, art thou so fruitful. So you say that he is trying to provide a geographical dimension to the source of the Nile. He's trying to thereby pinpoint, okay, that where is the source of the Nile. This was a very generic way of trying to address the Nile itself. So if you are trying to point towards equatorial Africa, you are trying to make yourself at ease with you see the span of the Nile. But at the same time, it also baffles the poetic consciousness of Keats. When he says that nurse of swart nations since the world began, art thou so fruitful? Note that, as Bradley had said in citing Escutio, that for Keats, there was a sense of loss. That when he is looking at water or the aquatic realm or the aquatic force or movement, he's thinking that his poetic aspirations they're kind of departing him. So when he kind of sort of questions that art thou so fruitful, there tends to be a sort of doubt in his mind. That is this the river that has kind of helped you see the development of such an ancient nation, almost like kind of the primordial nation, the first of the nations in the world. So there is clearly a sense of trying to mark. At the same time, there is a sense of sublimity and kind of confusion regarding the depths of the Nile. And at the same time, he tries to seek a sense of solace, as these lines say from his sonnet. Thou dost bedew green rushes like our rivers, and dost taste the pleasant sunrise. Green isle hast thou too, and to the sea as happily dost haste. Now, if we look at these lines, green rushes like our rivers, dost taste the pleasant sunrise. And if we go back to what Abdullah Gat here says, that analogy was drawn between inundation initiated agriculture, representing regeneration, and the solar demise and regeneration in the western horizon and the eastern horizon, respectively. Then you grasp the idea that there tends to there tends to be, you see, this bringing together of the solar circuit, that is, you see sunrise and sunset, regeneration and death. At the same time, there is this periodic kind of rise of the Nile, and how the Nile thereby kind of is seen as the terrestrial Nile and also the celestial Nile, in which you see the stars and the constellations they travel. And here there is this, I will bring this information from Marquis Gerard Freyd's dissertation. It's a wonderful dissertation, and I will ask you to read, particularly the students of Coleridge, Keats, and Shelley. Please give it a look. And in this dissertation, Reid tries to connect Egyptological information and the romantic idea of the Orient, the romantic idea of poetic creativity and sublime. So rate thereby notes that the inundation was recontextualized with the Sirius's ascent, and Isis was not only the aquatic but also the stellar deity. I will again refer to how Isis was connected with water and the stars when I will be looking at Lehan's poem. But as of the slide is concerned, try to keep this information in mind that Isis was not just, you see, the goddess of the star, but at the same time she was also linked with, you see, the inundation itself. And the Egyptians believed that the world is surrounded by this cosmic ocean, the Nile. And the Nile was often kind of seen as this the green ocean. And the Nile contains within it all this beginning potential of life, but it is also the Nile that will kind of engulf. So the Nile nourishes as well as engulfs, and the world is kind of encompassed by now. So when we look at red and how red is connecting Isis with both the star and the aquatic, then let's kind of go back to the slide which we have already discussed, that this is Isis here in her bovine form, and she is on a boat. So Isis stands not only for the flood, but she also stands for the rising star, Sirius, while her husband, Orion, stands for, you see, the Orion star and the Orion constellation. So when the Orion constellation is in conjunction with the Sirius star, that is the right time of the Nile to rise. So you see that trying to understand what the Nile stands for would also provide you the understanding of the cosmic sphere. That is why I have listed these 3 points here. That if we look at the Egyptian elements in Keats's text, that Keats brings the pyramid and the crocodile, because the crocodile stands for the dangers in the Nile, while the pyramid would stand for what the Nile was capable of providing. How? Because we discussed that how the building blocks were quarried and they were kind of set afloat on the Nile on boats and the barge. So the Nile, the very Nile current that kind of helped in the irrigation, which helped in transportation, also kind of houses a dangerous creature like the crocodile. So that is also a kind of the dual sort of aspect of the Nile. And the second point is important that if we look at the previous slides, the information given by Red and the information given by the other Egyptologists, that if you are an Egyptian, or if you have the collective consciousness of the Egyptians, to use Carl Jung's concept, that if you are observing the Nile, then you are also observing the stars. And thereby, you see the idea of the astronomy, the practice of the agriculture, they also kind of flourished at the same time. So the sky and the earth, they are brought together. So thereby, the text globalizes the Nile. So why globalizes? Because there is a very interesting point here where Keats says that green rushes like our rivers. If he's an English poet, he's trying to kind of contextualize the rivers of England with the rivers with the Nile River. So thereby that there is the Egyptians Nile. At the same time, there is the 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 guiding spirit of the river of the Nile, which can be traced and which kind of leaves its echo in all other rivers. The next slide, which will take us to Shelley's poem. Shelley's poem is very interesting because Shelley kind of deals with, you see, the oppositions. If we go back to the the third slide, in which Asioto uses the words force and unity, which Shelley thought were present in the water. Keep that in mind, force and unity within quotes. Now apply that in case of Shelley's to the Nile. Look at the opposition. And from the desert's ice-girt pinnacles, where frost and heat in strange embraces blend. So, quote unquote, force and unity. On Atlas, fields of moist snow half depend. God there with blasts and meteors tempest dwells. By Nile's aerial arm, with rapid spells urging those waters to their mighty aid. I am immediately reminded of that very oft quoted line from Kubla Khan by Coleridge: "Sunny pleasure domes with caves of ice." So you see that when you look at romanticism, when you try to look at the symbolism of the elements, try to bring this intertextual connection, these cross references, it will enrich your understanding. And I find this very fascinating. It seems to go on and on in which the different texts can be brought together. So you see that the very idea that for Shelley, and you know that Shelley was a rebel, so he was definitely trying to kind of look at a sense of creative outburst and unity within the very basic, apparent kind of register of tension itself. Just as we were saying that the Nile stands for. Let's go back to that slide where Abdullah Gathias says that the Nile exists in dual forms, that there can be famine as well as there can be fertility. You keep that idea of the combination of the forces and you apply that in case of Shelley's concept of force and unity, that frost and heat, then desert and ice-cut pinnacles. So he was probably referring to, you see, the mountains of Abyssinia. So you have Egypt, then you have Sudan, then South Sudan, then Uganda, then Rwanda, then Ethiopia. Okay, so Nile flows through all these countries. So he's trying to go back to the furthest kind of source of the Nile. So crossing the desert, crossing the undulating kind of hillocks, and gradually kind of rising up, you see the mountains of Ethiopia and Abyssinia, from where you see the Nile kind of takes its birth. So in a way, thereby the Nile to Shelley stands as a reconciliation of these two different forces, to quote the Coleridgean phrase, the reconciliation of opposites. But if we look into the zodiac again from Dangerous City, there we see the god Hapi. Remember, we were referring to the god Hapi, or the personification of the Nile, who combined within him the masculine and the feminine forces. The Hapi of the Egyptians here would correspond to the Aquarius constellation, and he is kind of holding the urns or the vases so that the divine waters of the sky, they kind of come down upon the earth, and those waters will again fall on the mountains, and then they will accumulate, and then gradually they will go towards Egypt. So you can see that the text of the Nile and how Shelley uses Nile's aerial urn matches with the Egyptian iconographic concept of the Aquarius positioned in the Nile in the sky, in which the stars are floating, and the Hapi as the Aquarius constellation is kind of again enabling the waters to flow. Now we cannot say with certainty that Shelley had actually studied the Egyptian constellations, but as I was saying that sometimes the text provides us with a lot of information not intended by the poet himself or herself. And that is when you see the joy of research is that you look into the text and you try to find out, okay, so there is this Egyptian pattern and symbols. So, thereby we can sum up Shelley's text in 3 points, that Shelley tries to probe into the elemental patterns of the aquatics. He tries to look between the frozen and the liquid, the different shapes of the waters. And reading Shelley's poem and studying the essays by the Egyptologists, we can thereby say that both Shelley's consciousness and the Egyptological insights, they talk about, you see, that how terrestrial and the sky symbolisms regarding the stars and the current of the water, they were all kind of combined and conjoined with the Egyptian mindset. So if you are experiencing the Nile, that is, if you are trying to kind of contemplate on the Nile, you are also being enabled to contemplate on the gods themselves. So that's a very unique experience that you see the Nile kind of provides us. The last of the poem, the sonnet, which we'll be looking at, is a thought of the Nile. Now Hunt has a very interesting title, a thought of the Nile. So he's contemplating on the Nile itself. And he also kind of, draws the architectonic symbolism like caves, pillars, pyramids, and he kind of, looks at Egypt like you see a contemplative dream, that the pharaonic Egypt exists in the memory, and he's trying to kind of contemplate on the powers and the metaphysics of that bygone days of the pharaohs through the connecting circuit of the Nile. And there is a very interesting line in Hunt's sonnet where he mentions Sesostris and Cleopatra, that roamed through the young world the glory extreme of high Sesostris, and that southern beam, the laughing queen that caught the world's great hands. Now, I was very interested to find out why Sesostris was mentioned, because Sesostris was a pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt. When we try to speak on Egypt, there are a few pharaohs who come to our mind. Okay, Ramses II is the most, no, Tutankhamun is the most important example, followed by Ramses II. Some of us know about Nefertiti or Nefertiti and Hatshepsut, but everyone knows about Cleopatra. Okay, because she had been kind of envisioned as you see personified as a seductress, as a film pattern figure. But what she was doing when Caesar uh, came from Rome to Alexandria is that she took Caesar on a trip upstream on the Nile. And this is where Prudence J. Jones, who has written this book, Cleopatra, the Last Pharaoh, a very insightful book, where Jones says that because Isis was linked with both the flood and the star, I was referring to in one of the previous slides that Isis was both the goddess of the associated with the Nile as well as with the constellation Sirius. So, sorry, the star Sirius. So when Nile and the Isis they were connected together because Cleopatra kind of developed this propaganda in which to her subjects she was the goddess Isis herself. So there was a pattern which he tried to reenact. So what is this pattern? As Jones says here, that the aquatic connection between the Nile and the Isis, because Isis was again, you see, seen as the one who was the agent of uh, the inundation required for the crops. So Cleopatra's river voyage with Caesar upstream enabled her to make Caesar perceive the rich heritage of the nation, the Egyptian nation, and to reenact the divine movement of Isis in the terrestrial level, communicating her, that is Isis and Cleopatra. So if we again go back to this slide where the gods are all sailing on the boats, and if we try to link with what Prudence Jones is telling us here, that when Isis, in the form of Cleopatra, in her earthly avatar of the Cleopatra, is enjoying a trip with Caesar, and Caesar was at the time the most powerful man in Europe, in fact, also in the known world. So she has to prove to the masculine presence of Caesar that I am controlling a country which is more ancient than yours. And to my subjects, I am a goddess myself. So that trip that she took was not only just a political trip, a trip required for you see the growth of friendship between Egypt and Rome, through you see the nuptials between Caesar and Cleopatra. At the same time, it also kind of refers to the Egyptian concept of the gods moving across the sky Nile on their boats. So, very interestingly, Cleopatra comes in that Nile sonnet. And Sesostris had a very interesting part to play in Hunt's poem, as Iris Suleiman says here, by referring to Strabo's accounts, that because Nile was so unpredictable, that as we were looking at the dual aspect of the Nile, that Pharaoh Sesostris uh, tried to control and also distribute the waters of the inundation by digging canals. Okay, and there is also a legend, though we cannot certify, that probably there was, a commission from Sesostris to link the Red Sea and the Nile basin with the canal. So you see that just as Cleopatra was trying to uh, prove herself as Isis by traveling on the Nile, similarly, Sesostris was trying to kind of study and understand the dual aspects of the Nile. As a good pharaoh who cared for his subjects, he thereby tried to kind of distribute the waters of the otherwise very very powerful torrent of the Nile in its canals, so that you see a discipline kind of arise out of that sublime power that Nile promises. So when we look at that in Hans poem, that roam through the young world the glory extreme of high Sesostris. Of high Sesostris could also mean of very heavy flood that happened during Sesostris' reign, and the southern being the laughing queen that got the world's great hands. The hands here could be the hands of Caesar as well as the hands of Antony, Mark Antony. So you see that if we thereby read the sonnets and try to piece together the information from Egyptology, then they all fall into place. And that is how you see that the Nile kind of, conjoins itself. I actually have another image from Dindara temple ceiling where we see this again, the celestial boat. So here is the goddess Nephthys, here is the god Osiris, and here is the goddess Isis. So this is you see the boat in which the three gods and goddesses they are present. So the very idea that if the gods and the goddesses have their own boats, so Cleopatra was just kind of following an already established pattern. It was nothing new. I mean, her subjects, her loyal subjects, would immediately kind of bow down from the banks as soon as the boat, the royal boat, kind of uh, turns visible on the Nile. So you see that Cleopatra kind of moving on the Nile is the goddess Isis with her sister Nephthys and her husband Osiris, kind of moving on the celestial Nile, the Nile of the sky. So similarly, if we like the evaluation of the two sonnets before. Thereby, if we look at Hunt's text, we thereby can see that the Hunt is trying to kind of contemplate on the geophysical, the religious, the aquatic, the terrestrial, and the cosmic kind of conjoining of powers of metaphysics that Nile and Egypt were providing to the ancient dwellers. So Hunt thereby kind of again brings together the male and the female authorities, so Sesostris and Cleopatra the Seventh. So that in a third point, thereby we can say that if we are traveling on the Nile, we are also trying to understand what the pharaonic Egypt was. And that also coincides with the romantic quest of trying to find their vision of the Nile, their understanding of the source of the Nile. Okay, so from that angle, the romantic vision kind of coincides with the cosmic Egyptian vision. And finally, with this slide, I will end the presentation. There is this beautiful hymn by Akhenaten. You must have heard about Akhenaten. Akhenaten was that pharaoh who was in favor of only one god, that is the sun god Aten. And Akhenaten had sort of, this hymn is attributed to him where he talks about the sky, the sun god kind of arranging for fertility of Egypt below, attributed to you see the waters coming from the sky. And if we look at how uh, the lines talk about this very collective consciousness, the hymn says, "Thou placest the Nile in heaven, that it may descend to them, that it may rise in waves upon the rocks like the sea." If we go back to Keats's poem here, see, green rushes like our rivers, the pleasant sunrise, green isles hast thou too, and to the sea as happily dost has hissed. I don't know how Keats and Akhenaten coincidentally kind of use the same imagery, but this again can be seen as an argument that the way that the Romantics were looking at the Nile to a great extent kind of equal to the way that the ancient Egyptians looked at their Nile. That is why I sort of provided the two parts in the title for today's presentation, that uh, the Nile and his her romantics, and the ancient Egyptians and their Nile. Thus it may rise in waves upon the rocks like the sea, watering their fields in their villages. A Nile in heaven poureth down for nations, nations in plural, for all manners of animals that walk upon feet. But the Nile cometh from the deep to the land of Egypt. So Akhenaten says here that the Nile is a gift from the sun god, or the personification of the sun Aten, for all the nations. But at the same time, it's Egypt that kind of gets that very prized kind of fruitfulness of the Nile that falls from the sky. So thereby, if you sort of take a voyage across Egypt on the Nile, you will thereby be able to kind of link together the past and the present, and that the Egypt as being used in the harbinger of civilizations in Africa, and Egypt to a great extent influenced the Hellenic world that we all know, and at the same time how Nile kind of links the sky and the earth. So it's very kind of a very collective idea of existence in the terrestrial and the celestial. All could be understood by see the geography and the dimensions of the Nile. So this is where I would kind of end my presentation. Thank you for listening. I also enjoyed a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Roy, for that a really interesting presentation in the sense that um, we are hardly Egyptologists. In fact, if I
I
can
am not
share
as well.
that, we are, so it had been a pleasure going through this presentation. We do have a question, and I would like to read it up for you, but I think you can see it in the comments section. Nevertheless, I'll just read it out. This is a question that has been posed by an ex-student of ours, Shampurna Chaudhuri, and it's flashed on the screen. So it's a very interesting question that she has asked about the Egyptian symbolization of both female and the male genders being present in deities or natural resources to a Hindu concept of Ardhanarishwar. How would you like
Yeah,
to address
yeah,
that?
yeah. Thank you, Shampurna, for asking this. If we look at, I keep telling my students in Presi that if we look at the divine pairs in our own mythology, then we'll see that, and this is again not my original idea. I mean, this had already been anticipated and explained and theorized a lot by mythographers. That the cult of Shiva and Kali, they had their origins in the non-Aryan cults of Rudra. And if we look at the the relation between Shiva and Kali, they seem to be in a more equal position as husband and wife. And the fact that the Orthonarishu tends to be, I guess that it tends to be more kind of comparable with the Chinese yin and yang, that the two exist in the same principle. Now, in case of the Egyptian coupling, uh, I have not seen any particular god or goddess who kind of have sort of conjoined the two forms, but they were syncretic forms. Now, syncretic forms are different from orthonarisha. In orthonarisha, you have the it's the bilaterally symmetrical body where the male and the female, they're conjoined in one body. Syncretic form would mean that the persona of one god is again mixed with the persona of another god, the god Amun Ra in Egyptian mythology being one example. But there is a very interesting story which Plutarch tells us, and the Egyptologists have written widely on this, that Isis was the one who provided the phallus to Osiris. Osiris's phallus was lost. And then Isis consummated her marriage with Osiris, and thereby Horus was born. Now, Osiris's body was hacked by his brother Seth, and they were scattered all over Egypt and universe. And Isis collected them together. Now, this is a very well-known story. I mean, it's often quoted and often cited by in different Egyptology books. So, in a way, probably the Egyptians were trying to look at unity in duality. So the two god and goddess, they exist side by side, but they are cooperating for the same principle. But there is one goddess, the goddess Nate. Nate is a very interesting goddess because she has androgynous traits. The Egyptian texts tell her that there are a lot of masculine kind of agencies in her, but at the same time she is shown as having the body of a woman. So, and sometimes the goddesses Sekhmet and Mut, they would kind of take very masculine forms. But then again, in the Egyptian art, because there is a sense of propriety, they would not kind of show the genitalia in that manner. So we have to kind of understand the ascendancy of the male principle or the ascendancy of the female principle on the basis of the costumes and the headdresses which the god and the goddess were given. So maybe the orthonarisha, which is a very unique Hindu concept, was not there. But we can definitely say that the duality, that the unity in the duality did exist, as we saw the examples of Satit and Nun and Isis and Osiris, the divine and the feminine principles. But if we look at Hapi figure, the Hapi, at the end of the day, Hapi has the body of a man. he has a beard, but he then again has the breasts, which kind of stand for the symbol of lactation and the production of milk. So maybe somewhere the Egyptians thought that it was more kind of the potential state was to show the personification as more masculine with having some feminine ideas, because the concept was that in the Egyptian art, the men are usually shown in the nature of walking, with there is a distance between two legs, while the women are shown as like standing. So the idea of mobility was linked with the male principle, while the woman would kind of stay back as a powerhouse of the self and the powerhouse of the she's the mistress of the house and provide the sustenance from behind.
For that
Thank you for your questions, Shambhona.
detailed explanation. In fact, if I might just add, and this is sheer curiosity because my knowledge of Egypt is so limited, but I did come across the fact that Isis and Orisis were not only a couple in the sense, but they were also a sister, brother and sister. So perhaps they are two sides of the same coin rather than just being conjoined together. They're two halves rather, but somehow perhaps they are, uh, conjointly imagined. Let's put it
That
that way. And
that's a brilliant observation. Thank you.
okay, thank you. But speaking about imagination, and this is again a question that I would like to pose. I have not typed it, but you see, I was so since you were looking at Egypt or exploration of Egypt through British writers, British literary writers. I was more interested in what I might rather say a little mundane, in the sense that you see, mostly as far as my understanding of Ozymandias goes, it was published around the early 19th century 1817, 1819. That's the time period. And it's very interesting that by 19th century the scramble for Africa begins in Europe, that finally gets consolidated in the Berlin Conference of 1883. So naturally, there had been an awakened interest in Egypt among British writers by 19th century, which we see in a form of romantic revival. So
Absolutely, absolutely.
how do you read it as a post-colonial critic? How do you read these writings about
Yeah,
Egypt?
thank you. Since you mentioned Ozymandias, there is not only reference to how the Occident was trying to map the Orient, but at the same time, just as you know that that's the twice and the thrice removal of truth. Okay, if we look
Hmm.
at it from the Hellenic, Platonic, and Aristotelian sense, that there tends to be a very negative, if not negative, a very kind of an ambivalent perception of Ozymandias slash Ramesses in the Oriental world as well. Because if we look into the Exodus, then we usually see that Ramesses was the one who had a confrontation with Moses, and because the idea of kind of the Renaissance, the idea of kind of reviving revival of the classics also kind of sort of is one branch of the studies of the Hebrew Bible, the Israelite studies, which actually kind of helped in understanding of what Europe is. So from that angle, you see, like if we look at, say, if we try to read into Endymion and Hyperion, Christabel, and also Mary Shelley, we will try to see there is a tension between Hellenic and the counter discourse of Christianity, all being kind of brought into this romantic textual kind of corpus. Another point is that the Romantics probably did not have a first-hand kind of perception of the Egyptian monuments in situ. They would have access to, you see, the bust of Memnon or Ramses in the British Museum at the most Louvre. So they were probably kind of, trying to look at, the way they would kind of look at, you see, a classical sculpture, and they would look at, you see, the figure of an Egyptian pharaoh from that echo of looking at, the figures of a titan, and often that is kind of removed from the actual place in which you see those statues were. For example, if we when we read Ozymandias, we try to link it with Abu Simbel. Now, Abu Simbel had a different kind of function, because Ramesses had kind of installed his sculptures there, just as Cleopatra did in case of using Isis, that Ramses wanted to show to the border between Egypt and the ancient Kushite kingdom that that I, as you see, the king, just as the sun sees in all horizons, I am also present in the different kind of the beginning and the end of the Egypt as well. Now, for the Romantics, it was not possible to understand the correlation between the religious symbolic location of Abu Simbel and the sculpture of Ramesses, which the Egyptians were able to correlate, because you see, when I was in Abu Simbel, I was told that the temple had been carved in such a manner that there is the statue of Ramesses sitting with the gods in the inner sanctuary of the temple, and on the summer solstice the calculation of the temple architecture had been made in such a way that the rays of the sun would, travel through the hall of the temple and fall on the body of Ramses II. So there, the metaphysics, the sky and the earth, geometry, and kingship, they are working together. Now, all these elements we cannot trace for the Occidental mindset as far as this 1818 or the early 1800s are concerned. For them, anything that is being discovered would be seen as a kind of, as a counter discourse to what the West has achieved. So, if the West is like basing its concept of development and evolution on the basis of Hellenic civilization, and when it is coming across a pharaonic civilization which is more ancient and which shows more architectonic superiority, then clearly there is a sense of tension. And how does one kind of engage with the sense of tension? By thereby developing an ambiguous and ambivalent sense of description. Again, it's not entirely my explanation. I have read it in the sort of the early historiographers. I don't have all those bibliographies right now in memory, but it's kind of if you are interested, I can provide you the list of those books, which I could not recall right now. But then again, I mean, these information were there.
Thank you for the clarification. But we do arrive at some sort of conclusive answer definitely there. So we have another question in the comments section, and that has been posed by Shopnil Shah. I believe the question has broken up into three parts because there is limited space for one comment individually in StreamYard, I believe. So I'll just read it out for convenience. He had posed this question. I was just thinking about the cultural dynamics between Egyptian metaphysical vision, landscape combined on one hand, and on the other, the English landscape with a temperate climate more suitable for life condition, and pointing to that. Was there any sort of cultural anxiety relatable to any of these poets you discussed?
The thing is that I think that would sort of can be contextualized not exactly in the time of the Romantic movement, but we have to skip a few decades when gradually there was this hustle for power between Nelson and Napoleon, Battle of the Pyramids and the Battle of the Nile, and because you see the British Isles tends to be, you see, more up there. But this is one connection which the Egyptians had, and of course that connection would not be kind of carried over to Eurocentric kind of mindset. For Egypt, you see, the world, uh, the origin of the world was aligned with the origin with the of the Nile. So they would thereby consider the origin of the Nile is the beginning of life, because the Nile is originating from the cosmic ocean. Uh, then again, this is something that Egyptologists have already established. And if we look into the geography of Egypt, then the north wind for the Egyptians would be a very pleasant experience, and that would come from the Mediterranean Sea. Um, but for the British Isles or people who are in the north, for them, I think that would be the opposite. So the kind of the remember that the good south wind kind of blowing, which we see in Presidential Mariner. So it's almost like kind of two different kind of parts of the the terrestrial kind of expanse. This is one. Second is that. And there is no way to establish from the racial or the genetic points of view, because the ancient Egyptian at the south of the Mediterranean and the English on the other side, uh, I don't think that there was any kind of metaphysical kind of communication regarding that. But one thing is certain, as I was kind of referring to, that if we look at the birth of the museum culture or the birth of the Eurocentric discourse, one thing definitely was there, that the French exploration and the English exploration regarding the Nile, as Professor Mukherjee here rightly pointed out, that the scramble for Africa, which also coincided with the quest for uh, mapping Egypt and trying to understand her monuments. So, like there was a you say competition, like who would kind of decipher the hieroglyphs first. So it was Champollion in 1822, 1823 who deciphered the hieroglyphs, which means that 1818, if that was the date for the composition of the sonnets, so for the three poets, there was no way to decipher the hieroglyphs because that had not reached them at that point. So they were clearly kind of trying to understand from whatever travelogues which were present, and most of these travelogues were kind of written by the French, or sort of they were taking the French were kind of taking their concepts and the information from other indigenous sources. Then you see the native Arabic and the Islamic sources. So in a way, there we cannot sort of find a direct kind of recontextualization of the Egyptian metaphysics with the English metaphysics as such. But yes, I mean, if we think of that, how the English and the French, they were both trying to sort of reach at a watershed moment in defining themselves as the inquirer of Egypt, then there definitely Egypt was seen as a kind of as a discourse with both the two Eurocentric and Occidental nations they were trying to compete with, and sort of yield information regarding it. That can be seen as a sort of cultural anxiety. Okay, that how I am trying, because you see that how we look at Louvre Museum and you see the London Museum. If the museum stands for, you see, the hub of intellectual inquiry, then the Louvre would stand for, you see, what France had been able to achieve regarding Egyptology, while the Egyptian compartment in the London Museum would stand for what England would stand for, or what England had been able to kind of achieve regarding Egyptology. So I think both France and England they contributed equally to Egyptology, because just as we have Champollion sort of deciphered into hieroglyphs, it was also Lord Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon who discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun. So in a way that there was always a kind of competition who would get to the tomb of Tutankhamun first. Okay, so that could be seen as a sort of that competition to that we are the English explorers or we are the French explorers, and Egypt kind of enabled that kind of competition.
Thank you for that really clear, elaborate explanation to our inquiries. I do not see any question as of yet on the comments in the comment section. So we would move forward to the vote of thanks and of the session. And I would request Professor Shudipta Mondul to please come up and deliver the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Durbadi. First of all, I am really grateful for this opportunity to deliver the vote of thanks for today's brilliant lecture. First of all, I want to thank our eminent speaker, Professor Anirban Roy, Presidency University, for graciously accepting our invitation and for delivering this really refreshing and at the same time thought provoking lecture. In his lecture, Professor Roy not only talked about how the Nile was represented in the poems of, I think, in the three poems written by Keats, Hunt, and Shelley, respectively. He also talked about in detail about how Egypt fueled the imagination of the Romantic poets and how uh, it served as a source of inspiration for them. So thank you, sir, for delivering such a brilliant lecture. Uh, I also want to express my gratitude to our chief patron, our principal ma'am, uh, Dr. Otoshi Karfa, for her unfailing support and guidance. I also want to thank our HOD, head of the department, Mr. Rajkumar Borman, for his constant encouragement. I also wish to express my gratitude to all my colleagues, both uh, from my department and from other departments of my college. And last but not least, I want to thank all our viewers for patiently listening to this lecture, for asking questions, for being interactive, because after all, this lecture is for them and they are the actual patrons of our project. So, thank you, everyone, and wish you all a very contemplative night. Thank you.
Thank you, Anirban Ray, for coming in and spending such a lot of time and explaining all these questions. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Professor Bourbon. Thank you, Professor Mondal, and thank you, Professor Mukherjee. I would also admit that maybe I am usually very particular about citations, but then again, the slides do not kind of provide that space for providing all the references I have tried to provide. But if the department is interested, then I can provide a further reading list, which had helped me directly or indirectly to prepare for this presentation. I have provided the most obvious ones, but there may be other sources which did not come across my memory while I was presenting, because I was not reading from it as it were. So if the students are also interested, then I can provide the list for further reading as well.
Sure,
Thank you
we
so
will
much.
be in touch and we will be in touch over our mail. So, looking forward to further interactions with you. And thank you again, Professor Roy.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.